For example, consider the Darwinian assertion that birds evolved gradually from reptiles over long periods of time. This would necessitate a transition from scales to feathers. How could a creature survive that no longer has scales but does not quite have feathers? Feathers are irreducibly complex. A creature with the structure of half a feather has no ability to fly. It would be easy prey on land, in water, and from the air. And as a halfway house between reptiles and birds, it probably wouldn't be adept at finding food for itself either. So the problem for Darwinists is twofold. First, they have no viable mechanism for getting from reptiles to birds, and second, even if a viable mechanism were discovered, the transitional forms would be unlikely to survive anyway. 5. Molecular isolation. Darwinists often say that evidence of common descent lies in the fact that all living things contain DNA. For example, Richard Dawkins states, "The reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals." Darwinists think the DNA similarity between apes and humans, for example, which some say is 85 to over 95%, strongly implies an ancestral relationship. But is this evidence for common ancestry or for a common creator? It could be interpreted either way. Perhaps the Darwinists are right. It is possible that we have a common genetic code because we've all descended from a common ancestor. But they could just as easily be wrong. Perhaps we have a common genetic code because a common creator has designed us to live in the same biosphere. After all, if every living creature were distinct biochemically, a food chain probably could not exist. Perhaps life with a different biochemical makeup is not possible, and even if it is, perhaps it couldn't survive in this biosphere. Consider Figure 6.3. Does similarity and progression prove that the kettle evolved from the teaspoon? In Figure 6.3, similarity and progression, it says, does similarity of design prove a common ancestor or a common designer? Did the pot evolve from the teaspoon? We have a teaspoon progressing slowly into pots. No, similarity and progression does not automatically imply common ancestry. In this case, we know it means there is a common creator or designer. This is the same situation we have for real living things. As we said before, the capacity of the DNA genetic alphabet to contain a message is equivalent to the capacity of the English alphabet to contain a message. The only difference is that the DNA alphabet has only 4 letters versus 26 for the English alphabet. Since all living things have DNA with its 4 nitrogen-containing bases, represented by the letters A, T, C, and G, we would expect a high degree of similarity in the information among creatures whether or not they are ancestrally related. Let's use an example from English to illustrate what we mean. Here are 2 sentences with exactly the same letters. Charles Darwin was a scientific god. Charles Darwin was a scientific dog. While the letters in the 2 sentences are identical, and the order is virtually the same, greater than 90%, the slight difference in order yields opposite meanings. In the same way, only a slight difference in the order of the letters, A, T, C, and G, in living things may yield creatures that are far apart on the hypothetical evolutionary tree. For example, while some studies showed that the DNA similarity between humans and the most similar ape may be about 90%, other studies showed the DNA similarity between humans and mice is also about 90%. Such comparisons are controversial and are not completely understood. More research needs to be done in this field. But if mice genetically are as close to humans as apes, this would greatly complicate any Darwinian explanation. But let's suppose that further studies someday show that ape DNA is indeed closer to humans than the DNA of any other creature. This would not prove the Darwinist conclusion that there is an ancestral relationship. Again, the reason for the similarity could be a common creator rather than a common ancestor. We must find other evidence at the molecular level to help us discover whether the common genetic code is evidence of a common ancestor or of a common creator. That other evidence has been found by comparing protein sequences. Proteins are the building blocks of life. They are composed of long chains of chemical units called amino acids. Most proteins have in their structure more than 100 of these amino acids, which must be in a very specific order. It's the DNA that contains the instructions for ordering the amino acids in the proteins, and the order is critical because any variation usually renders the protein dysfunctional. Here's where the problem arises for Darwinists. If all species share a common ancestor, we should expect to find protein sequences that are transitional from, say, fish to amphibian, or from reptile to mammal. But that's not what we find at all. Instead, we find that the basic types are molecularly isolated from one another, which seems to preclude any type of ancestral relationship. Michael Denton observes, at a molecular level, there is no trace of the evolutionary transition from fish to amphibian to reptile to mammal. So amphibia, always traditionally considered intermediate between fish and the other terrestrial vertebrates, are in molecular terms as far from fish as any group of reptiles or mammals. To those well acquainted with the traditional picture of vertebrate evolution, the result is truly astonishing. So even though all organisms share a common genetic code with varying degrees of closeness, that code has ordered the amino acids in proteins in such a way that the basic types are in molecular isolation from one another. There are no Darwinian transitions, only distinct molecular gaps. Darwinists cannot explain the presence of these molecular gaps by natural selection any more than they can explain the presence of huge gaps in the fossil record, which we'll talk about next. What about the fossil record? So let's quickly review what we've seen so far. These are the 5 lines of evidence which show that natural selection could not have produced new life forms. 1. Genetic limits. 2. Cyclical change. 3. Irreducible complexity. 4. Non-viability of transitional forms. 5. Molecular isolation. But doesn't the fossil record support the Darwinian theory? Let's take a look. Without the benefit of today's technology, Charles Darwin could not recognize the problems his theory faced at the cellular level. However, he did recognize that the fossil record posed a big problem for his theory because it didn't show gradualism. That's why he wrote, "Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory." But Darwin thought that further fossil discoveries would reveal that his theory was true. Time has proven him wrong. Contrary to what you may hear in the general media, the fossil record has turned out to be a complete embarrassment for Darwinists. If Darwinism were true, we would have found thousands, if not millions, of transitional fossils by now. Instead, according to the late Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, an evolutionist, the history of most fossil species includes 2 features particularly inconsistent with gradualism. 1. Stasis. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. 2. Sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. In other words, Gould is admitting that fossil types appear suddenly, fully formed, and remain the same until extinction without any directional change. Exactly what one would expect to find if creation were true. But instead of adopting creationism, Gould rejected the gradualism of Darwinism and formulated a theory he called punctuated equilibria, PE. PE suggests that species evolved faster over a shorter period of time, thereby explaining the huge fossil gaps. Gould had no natural mechanism by which this could have occurred, but since he was an atheist, he had to explain the fossil record somehow. This is a classic case of allowing your prejudices to taint your observations. But we digress. The main point here is that the fossil record actually lines up better with supernatural creation than with macroevolution. Indeed, there aren't missing links, there's a missing chain. There is no chain because nearly all of the major groups of animals known to exist appear in the fossil record abruptly and fully formed in strata from the Cambrian period, which many scientists estimate to have occurred between 600 and 500 million years ago. Jonathan Wells writes, "The fossil evidence is so strong and the event so dramatic that it has become known as the Cambrian explosion, or biology's Big Bang." This evidence, of course, is completely inconsistent with Darwinism. All animal groups appear separately, fully formed, and at the same time. That's not evidence of gradual evolution, but of instantaneous creation. So the Darwinian tree we are so used to seeing doesn't properly illustrate the real fossil record. In fact, as Wells observes, if any botanical analogy were appropriate, it would be a lawn rather than a tree. And that lawn would have patches of different grasses or plants separated by large areas of nothing but dirt. At this point you may be thinking, but what about the skull progression we're so used to seeing? Doesn't it appear that man has evolved from apes? A number of years ago, I, Norm, debated a Darwinist who lined up skulls on a table to illustrate that evolution had occurred. "Ladies and gentlemen, right here is the evidence for evolution," he declared. "Gee, how can you ignore the fossils? The skulls look like they're in a progression. They look as if they could be ancestrally related. Is this good evidence for Darwinism? No, it's not any better than the evidence that the large kettle evolved from the teaspoon." The problem for the Darwinists is that the fossil record cannot establish ancestral relationships. Why not? Because according to Michael Denton, 99% of the biology of any organism resides in its soft anatomy, which is inaccessible in a fossil. In other words, it's extremely difficult to discover the biological makeup of a creature by looking at its fossil remains. Jonathan Wells observes, "The fossil evidence is open to many interpretations because individual specimens can be reconstructed in a variety of ways, and because the fossil record cannot establish ancestor-descendant relationships." But this doesn't stop the Darwinists. Since Darwinism has to be true because of their prior philosophical commitment, Darwinists have to find evidence supporting it. So instead of admitting that fossils can't establish ancestral relationships, Darwinists take the 1% that fossils tell them and then use the other 99% of leeway to depict their fossil discoveries as filling any gap they want. With such vast leeway and no facts to constrain them, Darwinists have been free to creatively build entire missing links from fossil remains as trivial as a single tooth. This is why many so-called missing links have later been exposed as frauds or mistakes. Henry G., chief science writer for Nature, writes, To take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. Not only is the fossil record inadequate to establish ancestral relationships, in light of what we now know about the irreducibly complex nature of biological systems, the fossil record is irrelevant to the question. The similarity of structure or anatomy between types, sometimes called homology, also tells us nothing about common ancestry. Michael Behe writes, Anatomy is quite simply irrelevant to the question of whether evolution could take place on the molecular level. So is the fossil record. It no longer matters whether there are huge gaps in the fossil record, or whether the record is as continuous as that of U.S. presidents. And if there are gaps, it does not matter whether they can be explained plausibly.